Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's program, History at High Noon, North Carolina Women. The special program is part of the museum's programming celebrating Women's History Month throughout the month of March. My name is Stacey, and I handle adult education here at the museum, and we're so glad that you're here with us today. History High Noon is just one of MOH's exciting virtual offerings available as part of our History at Home initiative. So if you'd like to learn more, we invite you to head over to the museum's website at www.ncmuseumofhistory.org. Before we get started, we would like to take this opportunity to thank our North Carolina Museum of History Associates and Foundation for making today's program possible. Our associates and foundation provide crucial funding and support to the museum, which, in addition to many other things, helps make programming like today's program happen. If you'd like to learn more about becoming an associates member, you can head over to their website at www.ncmoha.com. We would also like to take time to thank those of you who graciously donated funds towards today's program. We do our best to keep our programming free to attend, but there are costs associated with keeping these series going, and we continue to be humbled by your generous support of the museum and its programming, so thank you so much. A few quick housekeeping tips for today. We ask that you please keep your mics muted throughout the entirety of the event, and to please type any questions that you have for our speakers into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of the lecture, we will ask the speakers as many of your questions as time allows. Also, as part of today's program, both volumes of the books that are being discussed, North Carolina Women, Their Lives and Times, are available for purchase through our museum shop, either in person here at the museum or online at www.ncmuseumofhistoryshop.com. All right, so now it is my honor to introduce today's speakers, Professor Michelle Gillespie, Dean, College of Arts and Sciences for Wake Forest University, and Professor Sally G. McMillan, Professor of History Emerita, Davidson College. Historian by training, Gillespie is a noted teacher, scholar, historian, and author of two prize-winning books, Free Labor in the Unfree World, White Artisans in Slaveholding Georgia, 1789-1860, which investigates the socioeconomic complexities that white tradespeople face in the pre-Civil War South, and Catherine and R.J. Reynolds, Partners of Fortune and the Making of the New South, the culmination of 10 years research into the industry titan and his progressive wife. In addition, she has published articles and book chapters and co-edited books focusing on race, gender, class, and religion in the American South. McMillan has specialized in 19th century history of the American South and American women's history throughout her career, and was a founder of Davidson's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department. Her two most recent books are Seneca Falls and the Origins of the Women's Rights Movement, and Lucy Stone, An Unapologetic Life, a biography about the abolitionists and suffragists. She has said, if you can understand the South, particularly in the years before the Civil War, you can have a better understanding about our country, not only in terms of the impact of slavery, racism, and white attitudes, but also in African-American attitudes. All right, so ladies, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks so much, Stacey. Sally and I are delighted to be able to be here virtually on behalf of the North Carolina Museum of History during this month-long celebration of Women's History Month. We extend our thanks to you, Stacey, and to the museum staff for inviting us. And we also extend our thanks to you, the audience, for being here this afternoon and for your interest in this exciting topic of North Carolina women's history. 2 days ago, this past Monday, the world celebrated International Women's Day. That same day, President Biden announced, women's history is American history, is world history. I think we can go the president even one better today. Sally and I think North Carolina women's history is North Carolina history, which is American history, and which, of course, is world history too. Today, we're going to share with you what went into the making of our 2-volume North Carolina Women, Their Lives and Times. We're going to highlight the contributions and significance of 5 fascinating women whose lives are detailed in a total of 34 essays. And then we will leave time for your questions and comments at the end. A dozen or so years ago, Sally and I met with Nancy Grayson, senior editor at the University of Georgia Press. She wanted to talk with us about the series she had originated for the press, titled Southern Women, Their Lives and Times. It was her goal to find women's historians across the South to edit state-based volumes full of captivating biographical essays, that captured the best scholarship on women leaders and change makers in that state from colonial times through the 20th century. The first volume in the series was published in 2003, and there are now 19 volumes in total covering every Southern state. Each offers an insightful collection of essays that are focused on the lives of individuals or small groups of women that address larger issues in the history of the state, the South, and the nation. It probably goes without saying that all these essays and all these volumes help us gain a much better understanding of the history of women and gender roles in American society, but it doesn't hurt to underscore that point. Reading the volumes as a whole is a tremendous education in the ways women in all their diversity have shaped the worlds in which they lived, often without the formal power of political office or public recognition. Sally and I were agreed that the invitation to do the North Carolina volumes in the series was daunting, but very exciting. I was thrilled to get to work with Sally, who I knew as a gifted scholar of many award-winning, path-breaking books on all kinds of key subjects in women's history, from motherhood in the antebellum South to, as you heard from Stacy, women's rights and reform. Sally and I agreed on so many critical points. We felt strongly that North Carolina women's leadership and contributions had been enormous, but too little recognized. We'd been impressed with Emily Wilson and Margaret Supley Smith's North Carolina Women Making History, published in 1999, the first ever one-volume history of North Carolina women. At the same time, we also thought that there were many more stories and context to provide beyond that fine volume. The challenge for us was, in fact, which women to choose, given the embarrassment of riches, and how best to reveal the patterns, complexities, and contradictions of women's experiences in all their diversity across time and place in North Carolina. We set out clear goals for ourselves that helped us make these choices. We were insistent on wanting excellent cutting-edge scholarship by terrific authors, authors who would produce smart, inviting essays. We wanted essays on women steeped in substantive and accessible primary sources. We wanted to make sure that the women we chose had relative connections to North Carolina. So, for example, when Rose O'Neal Greenhow, a notorious Confederate spy who drowned off the coast of North Carolina, came up as a subject, and who also has a monument in her memory on the coast, we said no. We didn't consider her a good subject for the volume because she really had no other connection to North Carolina than her tragic circumstances of her death. We needed to find the right scholar with the time and energy to write a great essay. We needed to balance representations of women across time, place, political outlook, class, race, and accomplishments. We wanted to cover a variety of women's occupations and interests. We wanted to represent Black and white women, progressive and reactionary women, and we wanted to convey their influence on North Carolina politics, society, economy, and culture. We were also much too aware that too few women in North Carolina had been subjects of full-length biographies, and we hoped our essays in these volumes would encourage more book-length biographies. Now, Sally's going to tell you more about the women we chose in relationship to North Carolina.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you all for being here. It is a true pleasure, yes, as we celebrate Women's History Month. I do want to add that working with Michelle on this project was one of the highlights of my academic career. She is absolutely incredible. So let me just give you a little bit of background into North Carolina women. North Carolina's early reputation was anything but sterling. Situated between the economic successes of Virginia and South Carolina, it only became a separate colony in 1729. Travelers making their way through the interior invariably complained about its swampy, forested, boring terrain. North Carolina did, however, claim some 30 Native American tribes, and its population grew in the second half of the 18th century as settlers moved southward, many from Virginia and the Middle Atlantic. There were slaves primarily in the northeastern part of the state where tobacco grew. Lacking a major port or any bustling cities, however, its Rip Van Winkle image emerged. The Civil War caused little physical damage here compared to other southern states, though North Carolina provided a greater percentage of Confederate soldiers than any other state. Women on the home front played a significant role in the war, tending farms and children and raising food to feed Lee's army. Like much of the South, North Carolina's white population experienced despair and hardship at war's end. The enslaved, of course, were jubilant to be free, but without land, they had little to call their own. They eked out a living as sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and domestics, facing racism at every turn. Though North Carolina enacted Jim Crow laws later than most Southern states, whites effectively kept Blacks subjugated and segregated. The 1898 Wilmington insurrection is one horrifying example of pervasive racism and white superiority. Many privileged white women embraced the lost cause by joining the Daughters of the Confederacy, dictating the content of Southern history books, and erecting memorials and statues to war heroes, playing a central role in upholding white supremacy. But women's lives opened in more positive directions. The state, even before the Civil War, demonstrated some commitment to public education. Churches and towns founded private schools and academies for women: Salem Academy, St. Mary's, Charlotte Female Institute, the State Normal School in Greensboro, Scotia Seminary for Black girls, and others. Educational opportunities opened doors to women. For example, Annie Lowry Alexander became the state's certified female doctor, setting up her practice in Charlotte. Margaret Jarman Hagood earned a doctorate at UNC Chapel Hill and undertook an engrossing study of farm women, mothers of the South. A progressive spirit emerged here in the early 20th century, part of a national phenomenon that fostered the club movement, propelling women such as Ellen Black Winston into social welfare and Sally Southall Cotton into founding women's clubs. Industrialization altered the state's agrarian economy as textile and tobacco factories opened in Piedmont, offering low-paying jobs to poor Black and white women, but at least an escape from farm labor. Factory work prompted, though, the unexpected: feisty women who demanded better working conditions and higher wages. Ella Mae Wiggins led strikes at Lorry Mill in Gastonia in the 1920s, and Crystal Lee Sutton at J.P. Stevens, she the Norma Ray in the movie, who fought for unionization and fair wages in the 1970s. The Appalachian Mountain region offered exciting opportunities for women. Dr. Mary Martin Sloop left a medical practice in Davidson to move to the mountains and open the Crossnor School for mountain children. Lucy Morgan founded the Penland School, which thrives today, a center for traditional arts and crafts that's known worldwide. And Olive Dame Campbell collected mountain ballads and founded a folk school named after her husband. Politics also attracted North Carolina women. Daisy Denson, the first woman to head a state welfare board, exposed the horrors of child labor in prisons. And Gertrude Weil fought tirelessly for the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote in 1920. Susie Sharp in 1949 became the state's first female judge, and several years later, the first woman in the nation to serve as Chief Justice of a state Supreme Court. African American women were similarly inspired. Ella Baker worked behind the scenes to support Black students in the Greensboro sit-in of 1960 and encouraged young Blacks to form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC as it is known. One of my favorites is Polly Murray, unable to attend UNC Chapel Hill because she was Black, and Harvard University Law School because she was female. So she obtained a law degree from Berkeley, a PhD from Yale, and fought for civil rights and women's rights. Later, she earned a degree at Union Theological Seminary and became the first African-American female Episcopal priest. A few years ago, that church sainted her. So these are but a few of the women in our volumes. So we will now share more detail about 4 women who demonstrate much about amazing North Carolina women. All right, I think I am first, is that right?
That's right, Sally.
All right, another favorite is Harriet Jacobs. Harriet Jacobs was an enslaved woman who wrote one of our most important slave narratives, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so, and you can do so online. Though filled with sentimental prose and serving as a confessional of sorts, it is one of the few slave narratives written by a woman and addressed to a female audience. This first-person narrative deals head-on with the all too common sexual predation by white men toward enslaved women. When Incidents was published in 1861, for decades after, readers questioned the veracity of Jacob's story. Her experience seemed totally unreal. As an enslaved girl in Edenton, she was fortunate to have a kind mistress who taught her to read. After the woman died, though, Harriet became the slave of a cruel white master. By her teen years, his sexual aggression towards Jacob intensified, as did the wife's jealousy toward Harriet. To protect herself, Harriet developed a relationship with a kind white lawyer and bore him 2 children. When her master threatened to send those 2 children out to his fields to labor, Harriet fled, hiding in a small attic in her grandmother's home nearby. There she remained for 7 years. Only at night was she able to sneak out for exercise. Finally, in 1842, she escaped, traveling to Philadelphia and on to Brooklyn, where her daughter was now working as a maid. Later, in Rochester, New York, she met abolitionist Lydia Maria Child, and she decided to write a book about her enslavement. Child became its editor. This is an amazing story, and one understands why people wondered if Child wrote the book. Did slaves even know how to read and write? Were the story and its characters real? No one knew. Then in the early 1980s, Jean Fagan Yellen became fascinated by the narrative and searched for evidence of the real behind the memoir. She found this indeed was real and all took place in Edenton. Linda Brent was Harriet Jacobs. Her oppressive master was Dr. James Norcom, and her white lover and father of her 2 children, Samuel Treadwell Sawyer, a lawyer. So all was true except the names. What fascinates Jim Downs, the author of this essay, is Harriet and daughter Louisa's life after leaving the South. As a fugitive slave, Jacob shunned all publicity, and she had to do so or likely be captured and returned to the South. Even when the 13th Amendment, ending slavery in 1865, Jacobs never escaped the fact that she was a Black woman. She remained in the shadows rather than profit from possible fame such as Frederick Douglass had done. Instead, Harriet and Louisa opened a school for Black children in Washington, D.C., went south to teach free people how to read, and her later years cleaned houses and lived in poverty. What incidents revealed is what so many Black women faced. They were Black, enslaved, and female in a world ruled by white, free males. Southern white men did what they wanted with their enslaved women. One had only to look at the lightening of the enslaved population to see this. One rarely talked about this openly, but Jacobs did, and her narrative implored her audience to understand her situation and the reality for thousands or tens of thousands of enslaved women.
Thank you, Sally. I'm going to talk about 2 women whose lives as North Carolinians are about as profoundly different from Harriet Jacobs as they could possibly be. That's Edith Vanderbilt and Catherine Smith Reynolds. As Sally and I thought about the women we hope to include in the volume, it seemed appropriate that the work that I had been doing on Catherine Reynolds, the wife of R.J. Reynolds, the founder of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco, would be important to the work we were doing here. So I was writing a dual biography of the couple at the time, and it really seemed to us that Catherine was a significant enough figure to merit inclusion in our project. But I also wanted to make this essay unique and to explore more closely a tentative theme that I had left out of the book. In doing the research for it, I had found pieces of tantalizing evidence that suggested that Catherine and RJR were more connected to and perhaps more shaped by the Vanderbilts and the Biltmore estate in Asheville than public memory had been suggesting. And the more I looked into these possible connections, the more I realized that Edith Vanderbilt and Catherine Reynolds had a lot in common as early 20th century progressive white North Carolina women, and that they might indeed be worthy of an essay exploring white women's philanthropy as a form of emerging social and even political white gendered power in this era. Those thoughts led to my essay that ended up being subtitled The Public Lives of North Carolina's Wealthiest Women. Although Edith was an orphaned child of National Social Register parents who grew up on Long Island and went to Europe to find a wealthy husband, George Washington Vanderbilt, the great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Catherine grew up in Mount Airy and married her first cousin once removed, R.J. Reynolds, the North Carolina homegrown chewing tobacco titan, their adult lives, Edith and Catherine's adult lives, followed some important parallel tracks. Both were widowed after 13 years of marriage to two of the wealthiest men in North Carolina. Both ran extensive estates upon their husbands' deaths, and both led progressive reform efforts at a time when middle-class Black and white women were emerging as real agents for more radical social change. While Edith made of North Carolina her adopted home for nearly 3 decades, and Catherine lived out her whole life in North Carolina, neither lacked for education, opportunity, or money compared to the rest of North Carolina womanhood, nor were they constrained by family, household, or work commitment. They had more freedoms, many more freedoms, from the deeply rooted Southern social order around them, a segregated world that cultivated social rules about white women's place and that reinforced a brutal racial caste system. In this sense, Catherine and Edith's whiteness, wealth, and privilege made them far more immune to the race and gendered strictures of their place and time, and even more so in the wake of their husbands' deaths, when they found themselves with even more independence. Both women wound up fashioning public identities for themselves as elite women, not so much committed to social justice, but to the more moderate approach of social improvement. Both women walked a tightrope that advanced white women's public influence, but did little to change race-based conservative and racist conservative sensibilities. Both women actively engaged themselves in the running of their estates, Edith in the enormous empire that was Biltmore, and Catherine in the more modest but certainly impressive 1,000-acre working farm that was Renolda. Both supervised staff and workers, even as they played Lady Bountiful roles, giving gifts to families when babies were born and holding employee parties on holidays. Both stretched those roles to take a broader interest in the welfare of the rural people surrounding Asheville and Winston-Salem, and ultimately the state of North Carolina. Edith sponsored Biltmore Estate Industries to train local white men and women in traditional craft practices so they could have steady wage work. She helped sponsor a training school for Black domestic workers. Catherine, who was a founding member of the Winston-Salem YWCA, used her leadership role to convince her husband and his management to provide hot lunches, water fountains, and housing, always segregated, for the company's tobacco workers. World War I found both women mourning the loss of their spouses, Edith's from acute appendicitis, Catherine's from pancreatic cancer. But both women also listened to the clarion call to women across the nation to cultivate victory gardens, to can and preserve healthy foodstuffs, indeed to keep the country going, to save democracy and the American men on the battlefields. Catherine led the Second North Carolina Liberty Bond Drive and taught women how to can produce in her Renolda village. Edith turned her beautiful landscaped gardens into vegetable gardens to feed hungry Ashevilleans. Catherine was active in local, state, and regional civic reform organizations and clubs, holding offices and giving talks. Edith was active too, including in the Better Roads movement. Interestingly, both had a very strong interest in rural agricultural reform, and this included being a part of what was called the Country Life movement. This movement is ironic to us today. It was a kind of throwback vision of a Jeffersonian agrarian republic, a golden rural past of plenty, where white men presided over largely self-sustaining independent farming households. As you all know, North Carolina had begun to modernize rapidly in the first decades of the 20th century, throwing up small cities centered around textile and tobacco manufacturing and providing wage work for more and more white and Black North Carolinians. Politicians worried, in fact, that rural North Carolinians were being left behind. These male leaders recognized that Edith and Catherine could fill a gap. They could bring new visibility and presumably new philanthropic interest to improving the rural poverty cause. So both Catherine and Edith became officers in the North Carolina State Agricultural Society, a once venerable institution founded in 1818 that ran the North Carolina State Fair, but that had fallen on hard times during the war. Edith was even elected the first woman president of the North Carolina State Agricultural Society. Fittingly, in the same year, women could finally vote. But there was a hitch right out of the gate. Each president before her had always been asked to give a pro forma speech at the opening joint session of the State House. But some legislators now balked at having to listen to a speech from a woman, which had never before happened in the State House. Although the objecting legislators lost their efforts to prevent Edith from speaking in a 15 to 25 vote, a second resolution was passed, that required the outgoing Agricultural Society president, Julian Carr, to give a speech alongside Edith, apparently diluting the impact of a woman standing at the head of the legislative body and addressing the august male assembly all on her own. On the morning of Edith's speech, crowds thronged the State House grounds and in the halls to see the spectacle of a woman addressing the politicians. Edith, wearing a homespun dress made of Biltmore Industries, told the legislators that speeches should be like a woman's skirt, long enough to cover the subject, but short enough to get their attention. And she then stated that women had come into their own and must shoulder their responsibilities alongside the men to fulfill their duty to community, state, and country. Edith would go on to use her time as president to seek more funds to beef up the North Carolina State Fair, which shared the latest scientific and technological advances and public health practices for rural families across the state. She built a much stronger network of local boys and girls clubs with deeply rooted educational opportunities and linked them to county fairs. And she pressed for and secured more new schools next to the new roads she was advocating for, so more children could literally get to school more easily. Like so many historical actors dedicated to reform, Edith and Catherine's contributions are mixed. By virtue of their prominence and wealth, along with their desire to improve society, they entered the North Carolina public arena in new ways, little accessed by white women before them, and virtually completely unavailable to Black women. They extended white women's public visibility and voice on behalf of progressive reforms that largely helped white North Carolinians. In the end, their efforts, even given their limits, brought increasing viability to women's leadership, making an important contribution to North Carolina in and of itself. Sally?
Thank you, Michelle. You all should read her book. It's fabulous. Those are such female activities, aren't they? Love it, love it. My second woman is Gladys Avery Tillett. Each of us as an editor took on one essay. We did agree to do that. And I took Gladys because I had a student early on at Davidson who was her grandson. And he wrote a short paper for the class. And of course, I had never heard of her and now understand what an amazing woman she was. So I don't think I can share everything that she undertook and accomplished, but I could talk fast. No, I won't. Tillett was born in Morganton in 1891 into a prominent family, her father being a lawyer and a justice of the state Supreme Court. Her mother was engaged politically and marched for women's suffrage. Education in the family was a given. Tillett attended the all-female State Normal and Industrial School, UNCG today, where she became a campus leader, foretelling her future. She then earned a bachelor's degree at Chapel Hill and in July 1917 married Charles Tillett, a lawyer. They had 3 children and lived in Charlotte. In the 1920 presidential race, Tillett cast her first vote. 2 years later, she helped found the Charlotte chapter of the Nonpartisan League of Women Voters, and in 1933 served as president of the North Carolina League. She led voter registration drives and then decided to work for the Democratic Party. She participated in Al Smith's 1928 presidential campaign, an unpopular candidate in the South because he was New York Catholic. That work, as well as her organizational skills and energy, proved her ability and propelled her into a position on the executive committee of the Democratic National Committee. In 1932, Tillett was one of 4 women from North Carolina sent as a delegate to attend the Democratic National Convention that nominated Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Democrats were awakening to the need to involve more women as volunteers and voters, and that led to the creation of the Women's Division of the Democratic National Committee. Tillett was appointed to the division to bring more Southern women to the party and to promote Roosevelt's New Deal agenda. She organized a massive conference for women in Richmond. Some 1,000 women attended. In 1940, Tillett was elected as vice chair of the Democratic National Committee and director of the Women's Bureau. That job necessitated her being in Washington, D.C. for 2 days a week and several weeks on the road, lecturing, holding meetings and receptions, organizing volunteers, and registering voters. She served as a delegate to the Democratic National Convention, again in 1936 and 1940. In 1944, Tillett delivered one of the keynote speeches. She and Charles did much to support the creation of the United Nations, and in July 1945 were in San Francisco for its founding. In 1950, Tillett returned home in part to work for their friend Frank Porter Graham, who was running for the US Senate. It proved to be one of the state's nastiest political campaigns, with his opponent, Willis Smith, hurling racist and communist accusations at Graham, an esteemed liberal and anti-McCarthyite. Graham's loss was devastating to the Tilletts. A month later, Charles, who had been hospitalized for depression, committed suicide. Tillett dropped out of public life, but returned 5 years later. In subsequent years, nothing seemed to slow her down. She worked on Stevenson's and Kennedy's presidential campaigns and was appointed to serve as a member to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, traveling to places like Burma, Togo, Tehran, Helsinki, and Mongolia, meeting with women and gaining insight into their condition. She came to recognize some of the great inequities that women in our country experienced. Her final work was serving as honorary chair of the state committee to try to get the ERA ratified. She was also a product of her time, believing, as many did back then, in eugenics and the need to sterilize poor and mentally challenged girls and young women. Tillett was awarded 3 honorary degrees. Her 3 children all pursued meaningful careers, and she was blessed with 10 grandchildren. She died in 1984. Tillett was an amazing woman, ever gracious, organized, determined, charming, and thoughtful. She never forgot a birthday or a hostess gift. She believed that her being Southern was a great attribute, and being a mother and beautifully dressed, a means to counter stereotypes associated with successful, forceful women. She also saved every single scrap of paper that crossed her desk, creating a treasure trove now in the Southern Historical Collection at Chapel Hill. A biography of her deserves to be written. Your turn.
Thanks, Sally. I'm just struck by when I think about contrasting Edith Vanderbilt in 1920, a big challenge to be in the legislature, and then in less than 20 years, what Avery Tillett was able to do. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
And I should share with the audience, this is the first time I learned the origin of why you did this essay. I didn't know it came out of meeting the Gladys Tillett's grandson. We're having him in your class. That's a wonderful, wonderful story.
It was great. Yep.
Well, my next person comes. This is just is going to be Charlotte Hawkins Brown. This is one of my very favorite essays in the volume, even though that's hard to say because we love all the essays, don't we, Sally? They're pretty fabulous. But this essay by Anne Shearhart is pretty special, I think. It's a great essay because Charlotte Hawkins Brown was, like so many reformers, full of contradictions and complexities. And the author does a really wonderful job of getting at them. Charlotte Hawkins Brown was born in 1883, and she's best known for her 50-year role as the founder and principal of Palmer Memorial Institute, a nationally known school for Black children in Sedalia, North Carolina, outside Greensboro. Brown doesn't necessarily stand up well to lots and lots of modern day scrutiny. In fact, I think we wind up sometimes, as we do with many of the women that we portray and our authors portray in this volume, as being disappointed in some respects by some of their choices. But in the context of her times, Brown was strong, courageous, and dogged in her press for more opportunities and more respect for Black men and women. Even her path to that equality strikes us as problematic today. She always changed many, many African-American women's lives and men's lives for the better. Charlotte was the granddaughter of a formerly enslaved couple who in freedom amassed incredible significant property holdings and in fact were among the wealthiest Black families in Henderson, North Carolina. They were wealthier than many middle-class whites in that area too. But Charlotte's mother, along with a dozen other family members, fled to Boston. They fled to Boston to escape the harrowing racism and white supremacy of the late 19th century in North Carolina. Charlotte's mother raised Charlotte as a devout Christian and provided her with a great education in a northern interracial urban world, so profoundly different from the one they had left behind in North Carolina. Charlotte would in fact identify as a Northerner for the rest of her life, even though she returned to North Carolina at the turn of the 20th century and made North Carolina her home until her death in 1961. So it's sort of a wonderful story to imagine. That is a 20-year-old Charlotte Hawkins Brown stepping off the train in Gibsonville, North Carolina, bag in hand in 1901, and walking to what was the institute that was then called Bethany Institute. It had been founded in 1870 by the American Missionary Association to educate Black children. She would go to teach there because she was guided by a strong Christian reform impulse. But within a year of her arrival, the AMA closed the school due to a lack of funds. Brown spent the next 50 years raising money and running what would become the Alice Freeman Palmer Institute, named for the Black woman principal of her own alma mater in Boston. The Palmer Institute became one of the best known, most highly regarded Black schools in the country, and Brown became one of the top national Black fundraisers across that era and in the country as well. Brown was an incredibly popular speaker. She gave addresses at schools and universities across the country, received many honorary degrees, and wrote 2 books. Across her lifetime, she joined numerous Black reform organizations, including the National Association of Colored Women. She was close friends with Mary McLeod Bethune, until, unfortunately, they had a falling out, when Brown publicly declared that Bethune's National Council of Negro Women, which had been founded in 1935, had failed to accomplish its goals of creating more political and economic opportunities for Black women by the 1940s. Brown, in other words, spoke her mind, was very direct. Brown never stopped fighting for herself, her school, or her students. She fought against prevailing segregation and racism, and against all the obstacles to voter registration and to election to political office in her Jim Crow world. Brown was always clear about her beliefs and what she needed to do. She wanted to expand educational opportunities and create more economic opportunities for Black Americans, and especially Black North Carolinians. She sought recognition and respect for her race. She wanted the same social, political, and economic rights for Black women that white women had, and the same educational advantages for Black children that white children had. In Brown's second book, published in 1940, Brown did some interesting things. The book was titled The Correct Thing to Do, to Say, to Wear. I'll just say that again. The correct thing to do, to say, to wear. And to us today, it seems to belie her core beliefs because of its focus in essence on proper etiquette. Brown's beliefs were always explicit. The Black and white women held the key to interracial form, that true Christianity had to be observed and lived out, and that education, culture, and morality must be taught to Black children. It was that last tenet and the way it's carried out in the book that can strike us as perplexing today. Because Brown's book really centers on that last core belief, it can be a dissonant read. It would have been it is a dissonant read now, but it would have been for many Black Americans in 1942, which was a time of intensifying civil rights activism. And in that light, Brown's book on manners and etiquette for Black society presents a complication. On one hand, you can set her book against Emily Post's and Amy Vanderbilt's famous etiquette guides. In that light, Brown's book challenged white notions about Black moral impropriety and degradation. Brown's book was really insisting that Black women were indeed ladies, and ladies who could match, if not surpass, white women's manners, speech, and attire. And here I'm thinking about the connection to Tillett, who understood the importance of dress and manners as well as a white Southern lady. On the other hand, the book seemed a little out of step, a little ill-suited to the changing times, given Charlotte Hawkins Brown's important leadership role, and really out of step with Black leadership, when organizations like the National Association of Colored People were creating legal defense and educational funds to challenge Jim Crow laws in state and national courts. Brown's approach then, in contrast, could be seen by some as too accommodating. I would love to dig deeper into Brown's life right now, but I also want to be very mindful of our time. So I want to encourage you instead to read this essay if you get a chance to get a fuller picture of Brown yourself. But I want to close out my comments about Brown with her own words. In the 1940s, she gave one of her most powerful and I think today prescient speeches at a freedom rally in Madison Square Garden. She said in that speech that until every Black woman dared to call her soul her own, all Americans, Black and white, were thwarted by the pernicious influence of segregation, injustice, and unjust discrimination. The future of Black women, she declared, depended on President Roosevelt's definition of democracy, which was the freedom of speech and expression, the freedom of worship, the freedom from fear, and freedom from want. For no people, Brown insisted, can exist half slave and half free. Charlotte Hawkins Brown's memory and her school are preserved today as a historic site, a North Carolina historic site. If you have not toured the museum and the grounds off of I-40 in Gibsonville, I urge you to plan to do so one of these days. Walking in her shadow and that of the 2,000 African-American students she educated, seeing the grounds, the building, the textbooks, and other objects that Brown, the staff, and the students used every day is a powerful and moving experience. It helps us understand and appreciate Brown's strength and accomplishments amid all her complexities. Well, now that Sally and I have had the opportunity to share with you some of our favorite women from our volumes, it's your time. We would love to know what questions or thoughts you have for us.
Thank you both so much. That was so exciting. And just a quick reminder, everyone, you can read these essays in the book that Sally and Michelle edited. Again, that's available for sale in our museum shop in person, or you can go on the website and purchase that and read these wonderful, wonderful essays. We have so many, just real quick, we have so many comments of thanks to you both for working on this and highlighting women's history in North Carolina and sharing all these wonderful women with the world. The first question we have is, someone is from Michigan. They said there is a Palmer Institute in Detroit. They focused on education for young children. Is there a connection to the Palmer Institute here?
Yes, I don't know as much about that institute, but what Charlotte Hawkins Brown was doing was using her former principal from Boston's name to do fundraising. So she would use Alice Palmer's name and go back to Boston to get the bulk of her funds from the institute. So I suspect that there is a connection. I don't know for sure that there is, but from my understanding, Alice Palmer was sort of a powerful and profound influence to many, many, many African women educators and reformers at that time. So I would love to know more. I suspect that there is.
Our next question is from Kathy. She says, how did you choose the women you talked about? They were all so interesting.
Well, Michelle said a little bit about that. The two of us just began to develop a list from what we knew and what we could read about. We wanted to make it inclusive. We wanted to make it diverse. We wanted to start with colonial history, although we had the Edenton Tea Party as a start. Including Native American women, Black women, white women, women of different economic backgrounds and different accomplishments. And so ultimately, I can't remember, Michelle, how many we actually had on our list. It was, what, in the 40s, I think. And then we had to pare it down. But also the other issue that was extremely important was having somebody who could write about that person. And, if there are no records, if there are inadequate records to write a good essay, or if there's no historian who has shown any interest in this person and knows anything about it, we had to eliminate, just a handful of women for whom we couldn't find an author. Nevertheless, I think that ultimately we felt really, really good about the overall list of women we included. You probably have something else to add, Michelle.
No, I would just say, I mean, there were some women that we hoped that we would include, and we would, we would find we thought the perfect author should do it, but as we know, life can be can challenge, so we weren't able, that author might not have been able to deliver in the time frame that we expected, or we'd have a really wonderful woman who we couldn't find any scholars doing sort of fresh new work on. So it really was a kind of process of saying, these are our criteria, these are the women we'd love to have, these are the criteria, can we find the right match to make that happen?
And confining it to 2 volumes.
Right.
That's true.
Yeah.
We could have done 4 volumes, 6 volumes. Yeah, we just feel like, we began to touched the surface in some ways.
Yeah, I remember picking up on that. I remember there was one woman, we had an author who we hoped was going to write the essay and then never came through. So you just have to eliminate that person then, unfortunately.
Right.
I'm sure many options to choose from. Embarrassment of riches, as was said earlier.
The other thing I wanted to add, and I was thinking about what Michelle was saying when she was speaking, and that is that these women, these are fabulous women, but they all have issues that we might question ultimately. For instance, Gladys Tillett and her strong belief in eugenics. Today we're horrified by that. But at the time, there were a lot of very prominent people who believed that. It's horrible. And then I was thinking about Harriet Jacobs, who, in order to deal with this predator, her master, she had a sexual relationship with a white lawyer. And in her memoir, her narrative, she has to deal with that. And there's some guilt in there. But that was her means for survival. And, so it makes these women very human, I think, to realize what they were dealing with, how they handled it, and some of their beliefs.
The next question is from Christine. She asks, have either of you done any research on Elizabeth Keckley?
Well, I think we both know a lot about Elizabeth Keckley. She's the former slave who becomes the very successful seamstress and civil activist in Washington, D.C., right? She's the personal kind of confidant of Mary Todd Lincoln. So Sally, I have not done specific research, but there's a wonderful, wonderful biography of her, and she's part and parcel of some of the very good biographies on Mary Todd Lincoln too. So she is fascinating. She was born in Kentucky, I believe, so she didn't get included in our book, as a result. But yeah, she's fascinating. Sally, do you have any thoughts about Elizabeth?
No, I was going to say that there is that book. Yeah.
Our next question is from Andrea. She asks, did Black women and white women generally or universally ever get on the same page when it came to women's rights in North Carolina? And she also comments, great diversity in the women you chose to highlight.
Sally and I are both like
my immediate response is I doubt it, but some of the arguments used for first of all, suffrage in this country in the South was very difficult. It was fighting against lots of beliefs about women's proper role, but also it became racist, unfortunately. Keep the federal government out of our state. We determine who votes. We don't want Black women voting. It became racist. So I honestly and truly don't know the details of the fight for suffrage. I know that North Carolina never passed the 19th Amendment.
Yeah, and I think about Glenda Gilmore's wonderful book, Gender and Jim Crow, and you really see Black women's efforts as being independent from and white women closing doors to Black women in the fight for the vote in the early 20th century. The one thing that I think is interesting is that when you look at the YWCA and sort of the spread of YWCA associations, in the early 20th century, you see increasingly more towns and cities having chapters and then increasingly chapters for Black women. And so, you know, you're just seeing the play out of separate but equal, and sort of this strange accommodation of these essentially white enforced segregated associations under the YWCA umbrella, and some effort for white women to support and sustain the Black chapters, but not a whole lot in that earlier period.
And of course, it was more than the Y. I mean,
Yes,
with the
yes.
with the Black, you know, a number of Black clubs versus white women's clubs, very separate. You know, the separation of the churches, it was deep seated.
Tracy asks, how do you select the authors to contribute to the volumes?
It's a great question. So some of it was just by virtue of being Southern women's historians ourselves, that we had a pretty good network. Sally and I have both been, and I think this speaks to something that women really benefit a lot in professions that have been typically male dominated. We were part of this, what happened and still are, the Southern Association for Women Historians. And that organization just celebrated its 50th anniversary, in fact. And it was organized in Kentucky and in 1971, I guess. And when the Southern Historical Association was meeting, and there were a few women historians there, and they just pulled themselves away and had a little meeting next to the furnace room in the basement of the Galt Hotel in Louisville, and that became an organization that has just really supported scholarship on Southern women's history ever since then. So we've been part and parcel of kind of that organization and the network, and we've been able to we kind of when we couldn't find. When we had a woman that we really wanted to pursue, we would sort of tap into that network, especially to see if some of our colleagues had graduate students or newly minted PhD students who had an interest in those areas. So I just thought it would be fun to connect up the ways organizations can be very helpful, women's networks can be very helpful to do this work. Sally, what would you say when we?
No, I absolutely. I think, yes, the Southern Association of Women Historians was pivotal. The other thing I think is, fortunately, there were some scholars who had written about some of these women. And so they were obviously our first choice. And I know there's one state, one of the states that did these volumes, they just purposefully only use graduate students. But we did not make that decision to do that. We just searched for the best person we could find, but also there were graduate students who have been doing research on some of these women. So that was a real positive. Let me just correct something that I said a minute ago, and that was that North Carolina did not pass the 19th Amendment. What I meant to add was in 1920. It was not one of the handful of Southern states that passed it. And thank you, whoever wrote that in, for reminding me that that was in 1971, that North Carolina finally passed it. I think Mississippi was the last state, 1984. So the South was somewhat behind.
You know, and one of the things I think that it might be interesting to address is that there were some women who were really influential in the 19th century and the early 20th century, whose beliefs and were very, very well known and very powerful in their own way, whose beliefs were so objectionable that they were hard to, I mean, to be honest, it was difficult sometimes to find authors to write about them. And we had to kind of encourage, I mean, some of our colleagues, I think. So Cornelia Phillips Spencer would be a good example. And we really kind of prevailed upon the noted Southern historian William Link, who's at University of Florida, to kind of get at the challenges of Spencer. So that also presented a challenge for us, because we thought we needed to have, as I think Sally has said, conservative voices in here, as well as progressive and radical and reform voices as well.
Yeah, some of those conservative voices were every bit as powerful as the women were highlighting. So yes, we felt we indeed had to include some of them.
And when you publish something like this, when you do a set of essays like this, for it to get published, after we put it all together, we put all the essays together, Sally and I write an introduction to try and frame it all. We send it to the press, and then the press sends it out to experts in Southern women's history. And we get like pages of feedback about, so these are external reviewers, and they write back about if they think the volume accomplishes what we said we set out to do with it in the beginning. And one of the ways we pushed the envelope a little bit, I think, with these volumes was to move in a cultural direction. And so it was interesting, not all of our external readers kind of loved a couple things that we did. I was thinking, we have a wonderful essay about the musician Samantha Bennix Bumgarner, and it's a fabulous essay about her role in country music. And I think a couple, we might have gotten a couple comments, and then another essay that I love in here, but that pushed the envelope, was about North Carolina women writers, sort of making the point that North Carolina has been a state that has produced incredible, nationally known, internationally respected women writers who have a very strong connection to women's voice and to North Carolina as place. So, we don't always appease everybody in kind of what we do, as we were trying to push in some new directions with this. And then other people say those were the very best essays and the most exciting essays to them in the entire volume.
Yeah, and I think also that some of them, those writers are still living, and that was
Yes.
another issue. I was actually an outside reviewer of another state's volumes, so I know that process from both perspectives about trying to convince these people that this was in these two volumes were great, and then from my perspective of analyzing volumes from another state and having to be a critic, both positive and negative.
Well, that wraps up our time today. I want to thank you, Sally, and you, Michelle, so much for joining us today and telling us just a tiny snapshot about these wonderful 2 volumes. I hope that you all will take the time and go read them. They are fantastic. And thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed our program saluting Women's History Month. We hope that you will join us for our next program celebrating Women's History Month on History and Highballs, Women Who Brew, on March 25th, 7 p.m. We're going to be talking to the ladies of Bombshell Beer Company. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful day. We'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.